Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about Thomas Hobbes on the state of nature. As you well know, Hobbes is the first philosopher that we're reading from this course. Why is that? Well, I think in many ways, Hobbes is the first philosopher in early modern philosophy to set the question about what it means to be human in a political philosophical framework. So, a quick background about Hobbes, the person. Thomas Hobbes was born in Malmesbury, England, and he was doing most of his writing during the early to mid 17th century. Um, Hobbes was the son of a vicar for the Church of England, who, well, as accounts state, was a pretty troublesome and quarrelsome man. I think at some point during Thomas's childhood, they had to leave Malmesbury because of all the trouble that his father would get into. Despite Thomas's rough upbringing in that respect, he was pretty well educated. He went to Oxford University and then shortly thereafter became a tutor for the House of Cavendish, which is a pretty notable British aristocratic family. And like many philosophers at the time, Hobbes was what we would call a polymath, meaning that he was good at a variety of different topics, subjects, fields. It's important to note that at the time, what we would now call academic disciplines weren't that well defined. So when someone was referred to as a philosopher, it generally meant that they had a good grasp of various topics. Hobbes himself was good at a variety of things like law, history, mathematics, science, and the like. But today he's most well known for his philosophical writings. Probably the most relevant part of Hobbes's biography is that he was a refugee of the English Civil War. Now, the English Civil War actually refers to three distinct civil wars that took place within a span of a decade or so. And the English Civil War was primarily fought between two competing factions. So, on the one hand, we had the Royalists, and the Royalists were those who supported the English monarchy. And then on the other hand, we had the parliamentarians who supported Parliament. And you can think of Parliament as the English equivalent of the United States Congress, in that they're representatives of various localities throughout the country. And to simplify matters, the war was mostly fought over contending visions of sovereign political power in England. So if you were a royalist, it meant that you supported the idea that the king or the monarch is the sort of primary or should be the primary political power in the country. Whereas if you were a parliamentarian, it meant that you thought that power should ultimately be vested in the elected, or not necessarily elected, should be vested in the representatives of the people. Hobbes himself was a royalist, although he was an unconventional one. Um, why is that? Well, during his or during the English Civil War, Hobbes spent most of the time in exile in Paris, France. And while he was in Paris, he wrote Leviathan. Now, like many philosophical works at the time, Leviathan was pretty unpopular, mostly because people thought that it was peddling atheistic ideas. Now, most people tend to agree that Hobbes was most likely an atheist in his private life, though he did try to keep his atheism away from the public. But when you do read Leviathan, you certainly pick up a lot of atheist themes and concepts therein. And what's ironic about Leviathan was that although Hobbes was a royalist, it was mostly the royalists who did not like Leviathan, precisely because Hobbes maybe sought to undermine the sort of religious baggage associated with what it means to be a royalist. Um, and another reason why it was unpopular at the time was because it pushed a secular conception of human nature. So during this period, we start to see the sort of secularization of sort of European philosophy, which will really pick up during the Enlightenment and then into 19th century. But in many ways, you can think of Hobbes as kind of an early progenitor of the secular conception of human nature. Despite it being atheistic, Leviathan, or the concept of Leviathan, actually comes from the book of Job in the Bible. Leviathan is a sea monster who I believe God references in the book of Job when he's talking about the power of his own creation. And Hobbes uses the Leviathan as a metaphor for the state's omnipotence or omnipresence in civil society. So if you look at the original cover of the first edition of Leviathan that I have here, you can't really see it in this image, but each of the scales of the Leviathan are actually individuals. And they all come together and they all are looking up at the crowned head of the sovereign. Um, so this image illustrates another important aspect of Leviathan in that it was one of the first, if not the first, articulations of social contract theory, which we'll talk about more here in a minute. But the basic idea of social contract theory is that, it's this idea that the political system's legitimacy should derive from the consent or agreement of those who are subject to it. Um, so while kind of having this aspect of this sort of aspect of liberalism, as we'll call it now, in Leviathan, Leviathan was also a justification of absolute monarchy, and as the term implies, absolute monarchy is the view that a system of government should be headed by a monarch who has supreme power over the political society, and the law of the land is essentially based on his or her decrees. Okay, so there's a lot of things going on in Leviathan, but one of the biggest concepts that you can find here is Hobbes' idea of the state of nature. And the state of nature is simply the natural conditions that humankind is in the absence of social and political order. So basically, if there is no government to regulate or control human interactions or human behavior, that would be the state of nature. And it's important to note here that the state of nature doesn't necessarily refer to a specific historical period, right? So it's not like Hobbes is saying that thousands and thousands of years ago, before humans built cities, before humans built civilizations, we were living in this sort of primitive state of nature. That's not quite what he's saying. For Hobbes, the state of nature is this ever-present aspect of who we are as humans, despite how advanced we become politically, technologically, culturally, etc. No matter how advanced we are or no matter how advanced we become, we always have the risk of devolving back into the state of nature. So a good example of this can be seen in the English novel Lord of the Flies, which many of you might have read in high school. But if you haven't, Lord of the Flies is about this group of English schoolboys who become deserted on a remote island, and they go from being well-mannered, educated English schoolboys to people trying to actively kill each other and undermine each other. So obviously for Hobbes, the state of nature is something he thinks that we should actively try to avoid, and we can avoid that through strong government. So before delving into what we read for this course, it'll be helpful to sort of set the background about what Hobbes writes in terms of sort of human nature in a very sort of technical sense, right? So um, the first several chapters of Leviathan, Hobbes sets out to give a detailed description about what human nature is from a materialist point of view. Now, this might seem strange because if you were to write a book about political philosophy today and you spent the first several chapters writing about how the light of the sun hits the retina of your eyes and that causes all these neurological reactions, that book probably wouldn't get published. But for Hobbes, his political philosophy is inseparable from his view of human nature. So what is materialism? In common parlance, if you were to accuse someone of being a materialist, it means that they probably have this shallow sort of love for material fleeting items like, Gucci designer bags or $1 million mansions or counterfeit watches and the like, right? In philosophy, though, when you call someone a materialist, it means that they hold the view that the world, the universe, or reality is fundamentally composed of matter. And you can think of matter as just physical, tangible stuff, right? So these are things that you can touch, smell, see, hear, taste. It's a substance that is pervasive within everyone's environments. This table that I'm using is made out of matter. This book right here is made out of matter. This coffee cup is made out of matter, right? So it's this idea that matter is a sort of fundamental substance of the world. And for Hobbes, he characterizes life in terms of matter that is in constant motion, and he distinguishes between two types of motions. On the one hand, you have what he calls vital motion, and vital motions are involuntary sort of movements within your bodies, within bodies that are characteristics of all life. So think about basic physiological processes like breathing, digesting, circulation of blood. All of those things for Hobbes would be vital motion. And they're involuntary because it's not like we can just voluntarily stop digesting. It's not like we can just voluntarily stop breathing. It's not like we can just voluntarily stop circulating the blood. These are sort of automatic processes that happen within any and all life forms. Um, the other kind of motion that he talks about is animal motion, and you can think of animal motions as voluntary motions that are based off our attempts to satisfy our appetites and our aversions, and we'll talk about what that means here in a second. But the more sort of advanced life forms become, they can start to kind of voluntarily make movements. So, if I'm hungry, let's say that's my appetite at the moment, is that I'm hungry and I want food. Well, I voluntarily decide to get up and use my legs and walk over to the kitchen and make myself supper. Right? That isn't a vital motion, that would be an animal motion because I'm voluntarily doing it. So for Hobbes, he thinks that, essentially humans or the human body is just, a bunch of motions, vital and animal motions within our bodies that interact with each other and with the outside world to create this sort of complex web that we call the human. Um, and in this sense, Hobbes really doesn't have much to say about the soul, at least not in the traditional Christian sense of the term. To the extent that Hobbes does believe that there is a soul, the soul for him is just a way to refer to our vital animal emotions. And for Hobbes, the soul is inseparable from the body. So here we can see Hobbes' atheism come to the fore because this conception of the soul contradicts the conventional Christian view, which is that the soul is incorporeal, so that it's not contingent on a body, in the view that the soul is immortal or that the soul persists after the body's death. Hobbes doesn't think that that's possible. He thinks that an incorporeal substance or incorporeal soul is a contradiction. So here's a quote at the bottom from the introduction to Leviathan, where he states, quote, "Foreseeing life is but a motion of limbs, the beginnings whereof is in some principal part with it. What is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels?" Okay, so back to Hobbes' idea of animal motions, which again are voluntary movements. He thinks that animal motions are directed by appetites and aversions. Appetites, or synonymously desires, um, are endeavors that we have towards some object, right? So for example, if I'm going back to the example of food, if I'm hungry, right, the object of my appetite, the object of my desire is food. If I'm thirsty, then the object of my appetite is water. And you can go down the list and they can become more and more complex. Um, and oppositely, aversion is an endeavor that you have away from some object. So if I were to order food from DoorDash and it gets here and it looks like it's been sitting out for several days, it looks like, it's moldy, it smells bad, then my natural reaction would be that I'd be averse to that because I don't want to consume something that's going to harm my body. So aversions are kind of the opposite of appetites. So you can think of appetites as the sort of pull factor and aversions as the push factor. Right? Hobbes here is using emotional concepts to describe human nature. So for Hobbes, abstract concepts like good and evil, love and hatred, he thinks these things can be explained in terms of our appetites and our aversions. So when someone says that something is good, what they really mean to say is that it makes them feel good, or that it satisfies their appetites, right? Or that it satisfies their desires. If someone were to call something evil, it means that they don't want to be associated with that thing. It means that it repulses them, all of these things. And for Hobbes, he doesn't think that ideas of good and evil or love and hatred just kind of sit in the cloud for us to access. They're rooted within our bodily emotions. They're rooted within our navigation through the world. So here's a quote where he conveys this idea, which I will not read. Um, okay. So far from Hobbes, we have the idea that human beings are one, defined by material bodies and bodily activities. So he doesn't really say much about the soul. He doesn't really say much about God. He doesn't really say much about, these grand metaphysical principles. He wants to start from the ground up. Second, human beings are moved by vital and animal motions. We're constantly in motion. We're never just idle. We're always in motion because we have these physiological processes that keep us alive, and we have these voluntary motions that we do to satisfy our appetites or to avert ourselves of things that threaten us. And human beings are again driven by appetites and aversions. Okay, now we're getting into what we read for yesterday and today. So Hobbes shifts gears to talk about, what does it mean to be human when you're confronted with other humans, right? And as he writes in the opening passages of chapter 13, he writes that humans are fundamentally equal to each other. Now, this might seem strange for someone like a reputation like Hobbes. Hobbes is often associated with things like authority and governments and absolute monarchy and hierarchy. So you wouldn't get the sense that he thinks people are fundamentally equal to each other. But Hobbes actually does think that we are equal to each other. Well, why is this? For one, Hobbes thinks that we're equal in terms of our ability. Now, obviously, we're all unique. We're all different. Some people might be slightly stronger than others. Some people might be slightly smarter than others. But for Hobbes, he thinks that at the end of these days, these differences are negligible because when you get down to brass tacks, anyone can just kill anyone. Doesn't matter how smart you are, doesn't matter how strong you are, everyone is mortal and everyone is vulnerable. Um, so if you're to take someone like, I don't know, Mark Henry from WWE, nicknamed the world's strongest man, right? Um, by virtue of his physique and by virtue of his strength, he might be able to overpower a lot of people, including myself. But if you were to get a group of 2, 3 people, they could easily just gang up on Mark Henry and neutralize him. And by that point, he would not be the world's strongest man anymore. So when Hobbes says that we're all equal in terms of abilities, what he's trying to argue is that we're not so different to where there's anyone that transcends vulnerability and mortality. The second sense Hobbes thinks that we're all equal to each other is that we're equal in the sense of that we're all trying to pursue and attain certain ends in life. So, simply put, it means that we just all want things in life, and the things that we do in life, we do them such that we obtain them. So, there are certain things that every person ostensibly wants, human universals like food, shelter, water, a good life, right? These are all ends that we're all actively trying to pursue. But even if the objects of our ends are, if the objects of our pursuits or the objects of our appetites are different, so let's say I'm someone that really likes to collect, rare baseball cards, and you're someone that really likes to collect, I don't know, designer cars, sports cars. Even though the objects of our appetites or our desires are different, the fact that we're wanting them, the fact that we're actively pursuing and attaining them, makes us the same, according to Hobbes. So, if everyone is fundamentally more or less equal, you would think that everyone would get along or that everyone would agree to disagree about life and whatnot. But Hobbes thinks that actually this natural equality leads to fear and what he calls diffidence. And diffidence is a fancy or archaic way to say that you lack trust or confidence in other people. Um, so why would this sort of equality lead to fear and diffidence? Well, if everyone else is also trying to pursue their ends in life, just like you are, if everyone is equal in terms of their ability and that they can kill each other just as you can, well, then that leads to a recipe to where you can't really trust anyone. Um, you don't know the intentions of others aside from the fact that they are similar to you in terms of ability and the fact that they're trying to get certain things. So this dictum is probably among the more famous phrases that comes from Hobbes' Leviathan, but it's this idea that the state of nature is a state of war of all against all. So um, when he talks about the war of all against all, what he means to say is that, because, or rather, when you don't have an overarching social, political, or legal order to regulate human interactions, individuals are going to be in a situation where we all try to preserve and advance our own interests, even if it means it comes at the expense of others. Um, so here's another famous quote: "Human life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish." So, in contemporary terms, Hobbes here is proposing what we would call an egoistic theory of human nature, or maybe specifically like a psychological egoism, normative egoism. Um, but egoism is this idea that humans are primarily driven by considerations of self-interest, and that we only do things morally, or that we only act in conformity with others when it benefits us, right? So, according to an egoist, humans don't do good moral things because there's this internal drive or internal inclination to do good. We do good things, we do the right thing because we're afraid of the social consequences or ramifications of not doing it. Um, so for Hobbes, he writes here, this is from your reading, quote, "To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequence, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, have there no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice. Force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues." So what he's saying here is that, when you don't have that overarching social, political, legal system to regulate human interactions, there can be no concept of injustice. There can be no concept of right, wrong, because you don't have the institutional means to determine what is unjust. You don't have the institutional means to determine what is right and wrong. Um, so, for example, in the state of nature, if I were someone who is trying to take away your house and your land, you can't just run to the census office and ask for a copy of the title title of property to show the proper authorities to stop me from taking your house and your land. In the state of nature, the only thing that would stop me from taking your stuff is if you were to fight back and kill me. Um, and for Hobbes, uh, the state of nature, or when people act in the state of nature, it's not that they're acting immorally, right? It's not like they're doing things because they're evil. They're doing things because they're trying to survive. They're doing things because they're afraid. And the state of nature is not immoral because the state of nature is not moral either. It's what we would call an amoral situation. So it's not a matter of morality, it's a matter of survival. Um, and so here I have a picture of a scene from Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, which is a movie about these dozen or so criminals who perform a heist. And then it goes downhill because it turns out one of them is a rat for the cops. And the whole movie is about them trying to find out who the rat is. And everyone is on edge. Everyone is antsy because they don't know who is the one that undermined the rest of them. So that's sort of a good illustration of the state of nature, in that we're always in this constant state of insecurity when we don't have a social, political, or legal system to watch over us. Yeah. So in chapter 14, he wants to draw out the implications of this natural condition of humankind when we do get into a situation where we want to finally live together in peace. Um, and here he makes a distinction between a right of nature and a law of nature. A right of nature is the freedom that we have as individuals to preserve ourselves and our interests by whatever means necessary. And when Hobbes says rights here, he means rights in a deflationary sense, in the sense that, when in the state of nature, we have a right to do whatever it takes to, protect ourselves, right? Because there is no social political system to do it on our behalf. Um, and similarly, in the state of nature, everyone has the right to everything. Um, and they have that right because, or rather, you can fulfill that right only to the extent that you're strong enough or that you're able to claim things. So again, there's nothing stopping someone in the state of nature from killing if it thinks that it protects their interests. It doesn't. There's nothing in the state of nature that prevents people from stealing if they think that that would advance their interests. So a right of nature is the rights that we have in the absence of social, political, or legal restraints. On the other hand, a law of nature for Hobbes is a general rule that guides humans towards self-preservation, and it prevents us from doing things that would be destructive to our own livelihoods. So you can think of a law of nature as sort of a rational precept or rational principle, right? In the state of nature, we wouldn't do things intentionally that would rain down to our detriment in terms of survival. We wouldn't help someone if we know that helping them would cause our own death, for example. Um, so taken together, Hobbes proposes these first and second laws of nature, right? And the first law of nature states that when that everyone should desire peace, everyone should try to pursue peace if it's a possibility. But if you have good reason to believe that peace is not possible, then you have whatever means you may use whatever means you can to protect yourself. Um, so this is intuitive, right? Because if you're in the state of nature, life is miserable, life is brutal, life is short, and you want the state of war to end quickly. So if there is an opportunity for peace, and you have reasons to believe that it might be fruitful, then the idea is that you should try to pursue it. But obviously, if you can't countenance on that, well, you have no other means than to protect yourself. And this goes into the second law of nature. And for Hobbes, he thinks that individuals should surrender their rights of nature if and only if they can expect other people to do the same, right? So this is basically like the state of nature or the state of war of all against all in many ways is like a giant Mexican standoff, right? Um, where you would only put your guns down if you know that the other people would put their guns down too. And you don't want to be wrong about that because, if you were to put your guns down and you miscalculated the intentions of the people that you're in a fight against, well, then they might shoot you and kill you. So when you put these two laws of nature together, and let's say successfully, there's an opportunity to win the state of peace and that there's an opportunity to end the state of war. Hobbes thinks that individuals will have to mutually renounce and transfer their rights of nature. That is, their right to kill, their right to maim, their right to steal, etc. And when they do this, they enter into a contract or a social contract. Now, it's important to note here that for Hobbes, the social contract isn't a literal physical contract. It's not like, when we turn a certain age, then we have to sign with a ballpoint pen this physical, agreement with 14 items. The social contract is more metaphorical. It refers to the kind of implicit agreements that we have when we live in a civil society with other people, and when we live together in a state of peace. So the social contract for Hobbes is the means by which we escape the state of nature. And we enter into civil society through this social contract. And again, we do this by surrendering our natural rights to a singular power or to a singular sovereign authority that will enforce the peace. And so you alienate the rights or the freedoms that you would have in nature, and you give it to the sovereign. Um, so, for example, if in the state of nature, my neighbor, killed one of my goats, then the state of nature, I would go to my neighbor's house and kill his goats as revenge. Um, in civil society, though, you have a state and a legal system to do that on your behalf. So it dispenses your right to enact revenge, and you alienate that right to the state. Um, so again, if your neighbor were to kill one of your goats, then instead of you taking your own initiative to get revenge, you go to legal courts for some kind of recompense. Um, and it's also important to note that the social contract, although Hobbes thinks that people more or less voluntarily accept the terms of the social contract when they live in civil society, you can't renege on the social contract once you accept it, right? So once you enter into the social contract, you become obligated or obliged to not violate it, to not disturb the peace on pain of punishment. So you can't just go back once you've already transferred the rights of nature. That right is alienated to the sovereign authority. Now, Hobbes is often derided as probably like the first authoritarian political thinker, right? And uh, this is obviously the case if we read, his writings about the fact that people shouldn't reserve the right to overthrow government if that government brings them peace and security. So a government can be oppressive, a government can be hierarchical, a government can be an absolute monarchy. But insofar as that government is bringing you peace and security, then you have no right to overthrow it and you have no right to revert everybody back into the state of nature. But the key word here is if, right? So um, if you're in a situation where there's a government that does not bring you peace and security, and instead it brings you pain and misery, um, then the implication of Hobbes' argument is that you wouldn't have any moral or political obligation to obey that government, right? So, if I were in a situation where there's this government that is stealing my house, is killing my neighbors, is taking my children, is doing all these awful things, is spreading disease and famine, um, then in Hobbes's mind, that's not a government that can claim any sort of legitimacy over you. And by that point, you would have the natural right to resist that government and to defend yourself.